everyone, it's Ula here, and welcome back to my channel. Well, I know it's been a while since I uploaded. In fact, it has been almost 2 years. Coincidentally, this very custom was started around the same time, somewhere in 2021. So, everyone, meet Sharif, an Arabian Stallion made by company Yaay. It's just one of those projects that took me a ridiculous amount of time to finish. And since the sudden strike of inspiration hit me at the end of January, I decided to choose him as my NaMoPaiMo project for 2023. If you're familiar with the event, you're probably aware that NaMoPaiMo rebranded to International Model Horse Painting Party, and some major changes have been made to its overall format. However, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I will leave the necessary links in the description box. My copy of Sharif is particularly bad in quality, with an additional challenge in form of a broken leg. Besides some major fixing and heavy prep work, I'm also planning on changing his mane and tail. The original ones are pretty cool, but I'd love to see him in something a bit more toned down. So let's begin with removing those. I have a tutorial on removing big chunks of model horses on my main channel in Polish, so if you'd like to see that translated and posted here, let me know in the comments. By the way, I'd like to apologize in advance for poor quality of the shots in early parts of this video. I promise both my equipment and skills have vastly improved since then, so bear with me, it will get better as we go. This model's hair seemed to be kind of glued on top of him as a separate piece, so they were pretty easy to remove actually. Well, at least the tail was. It only required a pair of sturdy pliers and some force. The forelock was pretty easy to lift off as well, but his mane gave me a hard time. I tried to prop it up with a screwdriver, but it didn't work, so I just grabbed it with pliers from the top and ripped away like a half of his neck. Didn't see that coming, but here we are. Some more pulling and lifting later, and most of the excess plastic was removed. Let's move on to prepping him. Despite the time that passed, I can clearly remember just how satisfying it was to remove all of those imperfections. As per usual, I also removed the factory marks from his belly. Alright, time to reattach this poor leg of his. Apparently, I kept it in a miniature first aid kit for some reason. Sure, why not? For the first attempt on fixing his leg, I tried to use a sewing pin warmed up above a candle flame. Yeah, you heard that right. This is not the last time you're seeing me fix this darned leg. Anyways, I milled some holes in both parts of the leg using a hot sewing pin, and then cut it shorter to serve as an armature. To make the bond permanent-ish, I used a 2-part epoxy glue. However, you can probably already tell it didn't work too well, so I wouldn't recommend it to be honest. And also, here you can see my old tripod slowly giving up on me. Oh gosh, I'm so happy I got a new one. Since this is the first video I'm posting in a while, I would actually really appreciate your feedback on what types of videos you'd like to see. I've been posting on my main channel all this time, and at this point we're so far behind I'm not really sure where to begin. So if there's any particular videos from my Polish channel you'd like to see me translate and post here, please let me know, I really appreciate it. Alright, the leg is somewhat fixed, so I take Sharif to a special date with my dremel tool. I drill a deep hole to put an armature wire for his tail in, and also remove all of the bigger chunks of plastics that are sticking out. Yet another disclaimer, I sincerely do not recommend following the tail making method I'm about to show you. Later in the video I will present you a much better approach, but for now let's see how to not make a model horse tail. As you can see, the wire I used is pretty thin and pliable, even though I twisted the base. You know, I could just skip all of this, but I really enjoy sharing all of my mistakes so that other people can learn from them. Anyways, it's time for epoxy. This is the stuff I will sculpt all of the modifications with. I thoroughly mix even parts of the putty for a couple of minutes until it's uniform in color. From now on, I have about an hour to work with the stuff until it starts to harden. Before I make any cosmetic changes, I need to fill all these holes and crevices. This first pass of epoxy is just here to smooth out the surface, so I don't need to worry about adding details yet. However, I do my best to make the edges as smooth as possible, using some water on my fingers or silicone tools in those harder to reach areas. When that's done, I set the model aside for a couple of hours for the epoxy to harden and then glue the tail armature in place. The following shots were recorded during a trip to my hobby pals, so the quality will temporarily get worse instead of better. Whoops. And yeah, his leg is broken again. And in attempt to fix it, I spilled some super glue on my fingers. If you ever find yourself in this situation, a piece of tissue paper soaked in a nail polish remover should help a lot. After recovering from this sticky situation, I fix the leg with super glue and sprinkle on some baking soda, which immediately sets the glue. Then I stick pieces of washi tape to the tail armature to give the epoxy some more surface to stick to, and I give it a super glue and baking soda treatment as well. Time to remake that poor neck of his. I prep the surface by wounding the epoxy with an x-acto knife. And yes, I absolutely should be wearing a pair of protective gloves. Don't be like me, kids, don't risk your fingers. I apply a fresh batch of epoxy onto the neck, trying to shape it into correct muscle groups as I go. I take a close look at some reference photos of horses in similar pose off screen, and I was also lucky enough to have some advice from my more experienced friends. I dare to say the neck has turned out quite nicely. I added the remaining putty onto the tail, however I kinda regret not being more patient. This batch of epoxy was getting really stiff and hard to work with, so despite my best efforts, the tail turned out quite mediocre. I'd recommend working slowly and patiently when dealing with a self-hardening sculpting medium like this. Anyways, I'm using my silicone brushes as well as my gum butler. This mysterious dental tool is actually my favorite thing for sculpting tiny details. When I'm done with the sculpting, I smooth out the surface with a wet, soft brush, and the next day I attempt to sculpt the mane. You have to believe my word, as this shot is so horribly dark you can barely see anything. Not that it matters too much, as I wasn't really in the mood for sculpting that day, and decided to scrap it entirely in the end. Feeling a bit uninspired, I set the model on a shelf for over 18 months. Don't judge me, I wasn't planning on abandoning this project for so long, but just like every time I looked at him, I thought, nah, next time. So fast forward, we're in December of 2022, when I finally decided to bite the bullet and took Sharif with me for a model horse painting and sculpting evening with my friend Madzia. This time I approached the mane in a much more thoughtful manner. I'm aiming for a soft and delicate looking hair, like an Arabian horse freshly prepared for an in-hand show. I lay down snakes of epoxy and work them into large strands of hair with a wooden tool. If needed, I cut off the excess putty with an x-acto knife to make sure the mane doesn't turn out too thick. And then I just keep on working on finer and finer details with my dental tool. Alright, I am really proud of this mane. However, the longer I'm staring at it, the harder it is to ignore the difference in quality between the mane and tail. I mean, it's a good thing I made a huge progress over the last 2 years, but not gonna lie, his tail is giving me Dolly Parton vibes. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely adore Dolly, but Sharif's tail was supposed to look a bit more like this. Yeah, I'm making a new one. First, I was planning on removing the top layer of epoxy with a dremel tool to utilize the existing armature, but it turned out to be much weaker than I thought. Seriously, it took nearly no effort to completely break it off. That's what you get for using a thin wire and epoxy glue, I guess. Surprise, surprise, his leg is also broken. Again. Yep, this will be the 3rd time. Honestly, I have trust issues now. I'm ordering a supporting stand for him. Later on, it turned out to be ever so slightly too tall, making him wiggle on top instead of stabilizing, but a quick sand down fixed this issue in no time. In the meantime, I made Sharif a nice, relaxing bath in a bowl of boiling hot water. My boyfriend saw this and immediately ran to the kitchen to grab a pair of chopsticks. Nie! Musi mu się wygrzać dupa. To Paweł's disappointment, I wasn't trying to brew a horse stew. I just needed to soften the plastic so I could remove the remaining wires more easily. Then I cool him off in some cold water so that I don't bend his back legs accidentally. Alright, let's fix this leg once and forever. I make deep holes with a handheld drill and use a piece of nail as a support. And even with this heavy-duty stabilization, he still seems to have a trouble standing. I actually think the angle of his fetlock is to blame, so I soften it in some hot water, adjust the angle, and set the new position in a cup of cold water. Much better. The tail is also getting a much sturdier armature. I took the thickest wire I found in my supplies and make some marks with a Sharpie. I then bend the wire to shape with 2 pairs of pliers, trim the excess, and we've got a promising armature. I set it in place using a gel superglue this time. The thicker formula gives me a bit more time for adjustments and won't spill anywhere else. I give it a couple of minutes to dry and grab a bottle of regular superglue to mix in with some more baking soda on top. I stick on some painter's tape onto the wire, but make it much thinner this time. I trim it with a pair of scissors and stiffen it with superglue and baking soda. Once the glue is dry, I sand down the leg with a round file. I want to make some more space for the epoxy, which I'm preparing right now. I mix a small batch and spread it on the leg. As usual, I've got some good reference photos displayed off-screen to make all of the bones, muscles and tendons as accurate as possible. And of course I blend the edges in using sculpting tools dipped in water. Time for the tail! I apply snakes of epoxy onto the armature and divide them into parts and finer hair strands. This time around I work slowly and closely follow my reference photos to make this tail as nice as I can. Oh, yeah, I drew a pair of eyes and a nose on my tool. Sorry, I just couldn't resist. When the details are in place, I smooth out the tail with a wet brush and set the model aside overnight. The next day, I can finally begin to properly prep this guy. Buckle up, this will take a while. I run my fingertips across the model in search of any suspicious bumps that need to be sanded, especially in the transition areas between plastic and epoxy. I sand those down and also remove any stray pieces of putty that I got on the model by accident. And since his hooves are super glossy, I decided to sand them down as well to provide a better surface for my primer to stick to. To finish this round, I buff the entire model with a super fine sanding sponge and give him a good old scrub with some dish soap and an old toothbrush. A thorough bath is necessary to remove all of the dust, grime and grease off the model, which can massively help with the longevity of your paint job. I rinse off the bubbles and grab the model through a piece of paper towel and allow him to air dry completely. It's primer time. I applied a thin, even coat, and once it's dry, we're back to prepping. As per usual, the primer revealed all of the areas that still need to be worked on, and not gonna lie, there is a lot to work on. The infamous leg also needs some more sculpted details, so I'm not even done with epoxy at this point. I sand down all of the bumps and imperfections I can see and mix a tiny piece of epoxy to finish off the leg. I also noticed there's a small bit missing in his ear, so I fixed that as well. I leave the model overnight for the epoxy to fully set and... Wait a second, where did his chestnuts go? I swear he had them before. Oh, they were just painted on. Marvelous. Alright, let's make him some chestnuts then. I mark the spots on his legs and make small cuts and scratches with an x-acto knife. Then add a bit of epoxy and smooth it out with a wet tool. And once that's done, I stick on a tiny piece and shape it into a chestnut. I just love making these tiny details, they really make the whole piece pop. When the epoxy is cured, I continue with sanding down the bumps. However, I can feel some grooves and crevices that can't really be sanded flat. I need to fill them with something. For this, I want to try out a new product, Citadel's liquid green stuff. It's kind of a thick putty that many fellow artists use for filling small holes and imperfections, so let's give it a shot. I applied the putty onto the model with a brush, trying to smooth out the edges as I go. It dries in a matter of minutes, and once it does, it turns darker and matte. It also shrinks quite noticeably, so I make sure to add more layers on top to fill out the indentions completely. Once the final layer is dry, I even out the surface with a fine grit sanding sponge, and so far so good. It's pretty easy to use, dries quickly, and gets the job done. Let's see how it looks after yet another coat of primer. That day the weather wasn't really spray can friendly, as it was super cold and snowy. So I strapped down to the basement instead. I make sure to wear a filtration mask, shake the can thoroughly, and spray the model. I'm applying a thin, even coat, keeping the nozzle around 15 cm away from the horse. And once it's dry, I carry on with the prep work. I swear, this little brat was not giving up easily. I sand down any remaining imperfections and apply another coat of primer. And now it's not done yet, but we are getting closer, I swear. I added some more liquid green stuff if needed, sanded, primed, and yep, it still took one more coat. But that was actually the last round. We're finally ready for pastels. I apply them with soft and dense makeup brushes and make sure to handle my model with protective gloves on my hands. I start the shading with picking out the lightest areas of my horse's coat. I don't think I mentioned it yet, but I'm actually making this custom for my friend Basia, as my part of a trade, so she got to pick a color for him. I was very pleased to hear she wants Sharif to be Chestnut, because I just love painting basic coat colors. After applying any new color, I make sure to flick off the excess pigment with a soft and springy fan brush. Then I take some black pigment and apply it to every area where the horse's skin is showing through. And I do my best not to contaminate the light parts with this dark pigment. I flick off the excess again and put some more of that creamy off-white color to the fetlocks and a small portion of every leg. Then I take a light rusty brown and apply it to every area that has no pigment yet. After that, I add some yellow ochre to the transition areas to make it blend better. I switch to smaller brushes to add some more details to the head. And just like that, we're ready to set the pastels in place with a coat of matte sealant. The weather was much nicer this time, so I'm heading back outside. Just like with the primer, I shake the can thoroughly and spray an even coat, keeping the model a bit too far away from the nozzle this time. This will cause some issues later on, but for now, we're back to the pastels. After the sealant is dry, the pigments look closer to the original shades, but they're far from being opaque enough. So let's add another layer. I basically repeat the exact same steps as before to slowly build the color's intensity. At the very end of this layer, I also decided to mix in some darker brown to gradually deepen some of the areas as the neck, shoulders and thighs. Let's seal this layer, and it looks promising. However, the hue of his coat is starting to look a bit too orange for my liking. To combat this issue, I grind down some purple pastel into fine powder and mix it in with the browns. This little trick should work with the power of color theory, as contrasting colors neutralize each other. I apply this mix to every orangey area on the model. Next, I mix up a darker tone and add it into the horse's knees, hocks and fetlocks, and then give it another round of lighter tones. Time for another coat of sealant. Okay, I think I managed to push back the orange tones, but remember when I said I sprayed the sealant from too far away? Yeah, that resulted in a rough, grainy texture, which affected the pigment's application. At this point, I should have grabbed a gym sock and give the model a thorough buff to make it smooth again, but alas, I didn't. I've no idea what was going on in my head at the time, but I was bound to face the consequences of my own actions pretty soon. Let's focus on the shading for now. I mainly reapply all of the existing colors to make them more opaque, and also deepen the darker brown a little more. I also decided to give some more love to the areas with exposed skin to make them a bit more pronounced. After another coat of sealant, I realized the mistakes I have made. Due to a rough surface, the pigments turned out quite grainy and uneven. At that point I was so mad I nearly stripped the poor horse down. I don't know what it is, but I can tell other people all about how it's totally fine and natural to make mistakes, but when it comes to myself, I'm so much more strict and unforgiving. Oh well. I took a good break and finally remembered to try out the sock buffing technique. And what do you know, it worked wonders. I tried to flick off the dust, but it picked up some static, so I had to rinse it off with water. Now that the surface is a lot smoother, I decided to go in with one more final layer of pastels in attempt to even out the colors. The most problematic areas were the darkest ones, as the pigment failed to reach some of the deeper grooves. So I'm mainly focusing on them, and also put a lot of effort into blending the colors together. The moment of truth. Is it better? Well, partially. There still is some room for improvement, but I think I have an idea how to fix it without using pastels. Let's switch to acrylics then. Well, as soon as I clean up this mess. The pastel dust is everywhere. I prepare a wet palette to prevent my paint from drying out too quickly, and then bring out the acrylics. Of course, I don't need this many, but lately my boyfriend and I decided to join forces and keep all of our model paints together in this neat organizer. I start with the white markings. My medium of choice is this acrylic ink from Vallejo. It comes in a perfect consistency and has very good coverage straight out of the container. I mix in some yellow ochre to tone it down a bit and start blocking in the markings. I'm making sure to paint thin and even coats to prevent any brush strokes or lumps from showing up. It usually takes multiple thin layers to reach the full opacity. This guy got a pair of socks, a pastern, and a strip along with a cute snip on his head. Once the markings are in place, I switch my attention to fixing the grainy texture. I prepare multiple shades of brown on my palette and grab an acrylic medium. This stuff is great for thinning the paint down and also slows down the drying process, making the acrylics a lot easier to blend. The technique I'm about to try actually comes from an amazing artist, Stephanie Blaylock. She shares some great model horse painting tips and tricks on her Instagram page, so make sure to give her a follow if you don't already. The results of this acrylic washing technique look very promising, and the method itself seems pretty straightforward, so let's give it a shot. I mix my paint with a bit of blending medium and apply it on the problem areas. I tried to use my natural brushes at first, but a synthetic one worked a lot better in this scenario. For now it may seem like I'm not really doing anything, but that was kind of what I was going for. I like the shade I achieved, so there's really no need to change it. I just need to smooth it out. I apply thin, even coats, making sure to blend the edges really well. It needed multiple layers, so I had to get patient as the paint was drying significantly slower than usual. Later on, I decided to add some additional shading into the muscles, just for fun. And I must admit, I kinda fell in love with this technique. After just a couple of minutes, I got the hang of it and had a lot of fun. And the results are pretty good looking if I do say so myself. So the acrylic washes are done. Let's get back to those markings and apply more coats to make them opaque. I also paint a base coat onto the mane and tail with a yellowish off-white. The reference photos Basia sent me featured a flaxen chestnut, which means the mane and tail get to be pretty light in color. However, I will tone them down quite a bit, since I don't want him to be as much of a blondie. When painting the hair, I make sure to reach all of those nooks and crannies, as well as put in extra effort not to paint over the neck. I leave the hair for now and switch my attention to the horse's head. First, I detail the marking by adding some light pink to the snip. I bring out the wrinkly details by applying a slightly darker lines on top. I then grab a super fine brush and add some hairring detail to the strip with an off-white paint. I paint the hairs in a spiraling fashion on the forehead to mimic the whirl. Next, I add more definition to his muzzle and eyelids by applying a lighter grey on the raised details and a darker shade into the crevices. I use very little paint and make sure to blend it well to achieve a soft look. Moving to the ears, I also mark the shadows and bring out some hair inside. Time for the eyes! To be honest, they turned out pretty mediocre this time. I just wasn't in the eye painting mood, I guess. If you're looking for some tips on how to paint nice eyes, check out my 2021 NaMoPaiMo episode. I also decided to add some more grey between the muzzle and eyes, as I saw many Arabian horses in shows having this kind of look. Let's get back to the mane. I prepare a variety of colors, from greyish yellow to rusty brown, and begin to play around with the details. I still do follow my reference photos, but also allow myself some more artistic freedom to achieve the best results. There's no real method here, I just slap some paint on and blend it together, really. Admittedly, this chaotic approach can result in me overdoing it sometimes, but this time the mane turned out quite nicely. I also take some time to detail the transitional area between the neck and mane to make it look more natural. With the mane done, let's paint the tail. I start with achieving a smooth transition between a brown at the top to creamy white at the bottom. Acrylics are actually pretty easy to blend, as long as they're wet, of course. And then I proceed with the details just like I did with the mane. Let's move to the leggies. This time I remembered about the chestnuts. That's unusual. So I do those first using a warm grey. And using the same color, I paint a base coat onto his hoof, particularly the only one without the marking. The remaining 3 hooves got a creamy light base, which I forgot to record for some reason. For me, hooves are one of those details that require some really good quality reference photos. If you're in need of those, I highly recommend finding a farrier or hoof care provider on social media. These are usually full of hoof pics. Hoof pics? Pun not intended. Anyways, I make sure to detail the hooves all the way around, as well as on the underside. I was about to move to the markings, but decided to go back to the mane for a bit. I thought the ends needed some more love. Slowly and carefully, I lengthened the fine hairs over the neck to achieve a soft, natural look. And before you ask, these tiny white speckles on the model come from my own laziness. As you probably saw in this video, I tend to use my gloves as an additional paint palette. Once this paint dries and I move my hand around, it crumbles and falls right into the model. Is it more work to rinse it off later? Yes. Will I keep doing it? Also yes. Okay, now I can finally finish off the markings. I mixed the tiniest bit of brown and yellow into my white to achieve a very light shade of grey. I paint a thin coat over the entire sock, taking the opportunity to clean up the hair details on the hoof edge. Once that's done, I pick up some off-white and paint it over the grey with short and thin brush strokes, imitating the hair pattern. And I finish it off with some light pink in the very back of the pastern and to highlight the ligaments. Once all of the legs are detailed, I add my signature and a year of completion in a less visible area, and give the model a good rinse to get rid of all the dust and speckles. The next day we are ready for the final coat of sealant. I honestly was a bit worried about the areas I treated with my blending medium, as it turned out pretty shiny, But luckily my sealant was strong enough to perfectly even out the finish. After a couple of hours, it's time for the very final step. Glossing the eyes. I apply 3 coats to each eye for that sweet glass-like finish, and also a single coat inside the nostrils to make them appear wet. And just like that, after nearly 2 years of stalling, Sharif is complete. Stalling. I can't with the accidental puns today. As his owner, Basia got to pick a name for him as well. Everyone, meet Fudo. His name is inspired by a Japanese god of fire. How cool is that? As you can probably tell, I did not make it in time for NaMoPaiMo. I know there hasn't really been a strict deadline this year, but I still wanted to make it. However, I finished working on him on April 13th, and this also makes for my very first completed piece this year. I try not to worry about this too much, as I'm having a ton of other projects going on in the background, including my master's degree. Some of these secret projects, however, are in fact meant to make it to this channel, so make sure to subscribe not to miss out. When it comes to Fudo, I must admit I'm really proud of how he's turned out. It's just one of those projects that drag you through all of those difficulties, only for you to improve massively. And I do feel like I improved actually. I tried out a very cool new technique and put my entire heart into making him. I hope it shows. He's not perfect, of course, by any means. Granted, producing a flawless artwork as a common mortal is even an option. As much as I loved the acrylic washes, I need to find a different blending medium. This one turned out too shiny and a bit tacky, which resulted in some lint getting permanently stuck underneath the sealant. His eyes could also be a lot better, I think. On the bright side, I'm really proud of his mane and tail, both in the sculpting and painting department. Well, let me know what do you think about Fudo. I can't wait to read your comments. Not only about the model itself, but I'm also very curious to see which videos you would like for me to translate and post here. You can find them on my Polish channel, which is linked down below. Make sure to check out my Instagram as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video soon. I hope.